All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. This is a roundtable organized by the Earth System Governance Research Center, BAS. So I'm going to share some slides. So the title of our session is Reimagining Transition. We believe this is a very important topic to think about how we are going to make sustainability transition feasible and faster. We are very pleased to have a wonderful panel today, which includes Professor Peter Newell from University of Sussex, Professor Shamini Newell from Linwood University, Professor Prakash Kashwan from Brandeis University, and Professor Joost Vertvoet from Utrecht University, and also two members of our Earth System Governance Research Center, BAS, my colleague Sophia, and also myself. Before we get into the topic, I just want to mention very briefly our research center here at the University of Bath. Because we are one of the latest addition to the Earth System Governance research project. So we want to highlight or remind people what we are doing. So we only established in September 2022, but we are already 2 years old. But we really try hard to make a lot of activities and build a research hub to bring together sustainability scholars across the university, but also in the region and the country, especially in social sciences, but also beyond. So we have identified 4 research themes now. I think this ranges from global governance and international political economy and to like politics and social movement for transition, which is very close to today's topic, but also the question around justice, education, and young people, as well as this kind of transformation knowledge in the context of Anthropocene, really to take a forward-looking approach, think about the future that we want. So they are all very closely connected to today's topic. This is why we came up with the idea of this session. We do also a lot of activities. We want people to engage with us. So we have a fortnightly seminar series, mostly in person, but sometimes we also organize hybrid seminars, but we also organize workshops and conferences from time to time. And we try to do this at least once per year. And we have also a lot of collaborative projects with our partners in the Earth System Governance Network, but also beyond. So we'd like to, if you're interested in our work, you can look at our website, but also you can get in touch with us. We'd like to work with people sharing common interest. Without further ado, I would like to get into the topic of today. So I'll give the floor to my colleague Sophia to introduce the session.
Thank you so much, Ishan, and thank you so much for the panelists for accepting the invitation to be part of this panel, but also to the people, the participants who took the opportunity to come and join this session. We're very, very pleased to have you here. So just a few words that the plan is to simply set out the rationale for this session, and also say a few things about how we came up with this particular topic. So I think when with Ishan and also our colleague Michael, who is not here, I think today, when we were discussing what should we be doing for ESG this year, we just wanted to create a space and an opportunity where researchers with very different backgrounds in terms of disciplinary backgrounds, expertise, and so on, will come together and discuss this very important topic of transitions and the importance of reimagining transitions today. And I want to say just a few things for the next 5-6 minutes around this idea of the need to reimagine transitions. And because I think we all accept that this idea that we need a transition is omnipresent in climate discourses today, and we can take here the example of science as a starting point, and I'm thinking here of the IPCC, of course, which clearly states that there is an urgent need to transition away from existing carbon-intensive ways to organize our economies and our societies. And of course, this was one of the key messages that came out of COP28 in Dubai last year, where all parties agreed on a roadmap for transitioning away from fossil fuels, which was, of course, very welcome news. And now there is, of course, a very relevant, thriving academic scholarship on transitions. And I feel that everybody here on this panel contributes to this thriving field in their own way. And I think it's quite fair to say that there is today a field of transition studies indeed. And this field encompasses energy transitions, with a little bit more focus on socio-technical systems and the kind of innovations required to decarbonize energy production in contemporary contexts, all the way to what we can more broadly call socio-ecological transitions. And of course, the idea of a just transition is today gaining traction, bringing into the spotlight more concretely questions around justice. And overall, if we look at the Earth system governance scholarship, there is a lot about transitions all the way from the planetary to the national and the local level. We also note that policymakers have adopted this language of transitions, and there is indeed a very rich portfolio of policy proposals designed to help today's societies to transition to a low-carbon future. And this idea of transitioning to a new green phase in human history may sound like a novel idea, but essentially the vocabulary that permits this discourse of green transition today has a very long history. Of course, it emerged first in the 1950s, then again in the 1970s as a response to the energy crisis of the era. And of course, again, in the 1980s, at the United Nations Conference on New and Renewable Sources of Energy. And I feel that this idea of an energy transition somehow dominates the global energy debate. And I think it's also quite correct to say that this institutionalization, but also formalization of transitions in public policy today demonstrates that this idea of transition has quite firmly grasped our political imagination, and this is manifest, of course, in our political discourses. But there's also a lot of pushback and a lot of criticism around transitions, and this is where I would like to raise a few points that hopefully we will have the opportunity to discuss today in our session. And I think that the point of these criticisms is not so much the idea that the idea of transition is wrong or problematic in itself, but there are more points of disagreements around the social and political conflicts contained within what we can call today transition politics. So, for example, transition is very frequently criticized because of the length of transition processes. So these critics, for example, identify the problem with with technological and economic complexities of transition, which of course means that more rapid changes are prevented. A relevant criticism here is the idea that the politics through which transition is advanced is problematic in the sense that the knowledges that are accepted as legitimate in transition discourses and politics allow little space for marginalized perspectives, methods, worldviews, and so on. And the result, of course, is that transitions may sound quite technocratic, and this, some critics say fairly, I think, disengages the public and audiences behind experts, policymakers, or even researchers. So transition becomes linked to what we can call a more business as usual approach to our climate condition. And this is particularly damaging when we know that having the public on board is essential to implement certain aspects of a just socio-ecological transition. And finally, there is also concern that precisely this business as usual approach to transition manifests as extractivism in very material terms, whereby in the name of transition, we actually experience further ecological damage and human devastation in the present, in the name of a greener future, which is to arrive in 2040, 2050, or 2060. So our goal on this session for the next 75 minutes or so is to try and unpack in a more nuanced, I hope, way, the aspects of transition that require reimagining from the perspective that we can bring to this discussion as academics, as researchers, but also as activists. And my hope is that we will have a very diverse set of opinions and views on this panel. Right, so we have prepared a set of questions for our panelists. So I would like to start by raising the first question for our panelists. And you will have around 5 minutes to respond to this question. And the first question is, if you can please introduce a little bit your area of expertise, tell us the area of transitions you're working on, and then what is the aspect of transitions to sustainable futures that you think should be reimagined. And Ishan, may I start with you because of how I see people on my screen?
Okay, so thank you, Sophia. So I think I'll just try to kick off very briefly. And yeah, so just to introduce my work. So I do work mostly on like emerging economies and trying to understand how the role of emerging economies in global environmental governance and through like various engagements, not only their own transformation within the countries, but also like their overseas or international activities. So recently I started a project which is now also affiliated with the Earth System Governance projects to look at sustainability governance of Chinese overseas infrastructure investment. And so my motivation is trying to really kind of to investigate these tensions between sustainability and development. I think this is an old problem that we know for a very long time. I mean, back to the Rio conference to think about the concept of sustainable development, how to make development and environmental sustainability compatible. But today, I think the problem is still there. So because I'm very interested in the global south and think about the socio-economic development these countries need. But at the same time, we've seen, I think, the environmental conditions have been worsened over the last 30, 40 years. Although we have sustainable development as a concept and we talk about sustainability transition, but the problem is has not been solved, but it's getting worse. So why this is a problem? But then I think if you're trying to understand the views and the voices of people in these countries, you also see a lot of tensions. I think here I want to explore or elaborate two dynamics. One is about kind of these tensions within the global south and different stakeholders in the global south. Sometimes I think if we think about the case of infrastructure development, often you have governments which have their own agenda, and sometimes you have vested interest in large scale infrastructure development, but then you have local communities or other stakeholders. They see a lot of damages being made by these development projects. They understand the promise made by the government. They also know the benefits of infrastructure development, but at the same time, in most cases or in many cases, the promise of the government were not delivered. And then I think the tensions just continues to increase. And then I think you see a lot of resistance from the communities to the projects. I think if you understand the intention from the beginning, of course, I think my perspective is you need this kind of infrastructure to support development. I think this is important or necessary to some extent, but at the same time, we have to think about how to address these tensions. So different stakeholders have very different views, it's very difficult to get a consensus for them to think about a pathway forward for the future. And then often developing countries get stuck. And then I think if you don't have a very promising investment portfolio, then you often get a lot of troubles economically. And then I think you would lose interest of foreign investors, support from international financial system. Then I think you get this kind of circular problems in the country. So I think this is one important issue. Then we have to think about how to get out of this. The other thing I think is more deeply, it's really about what kind of development do we want. So we often talk about environmental friendly development these days, and then we think about the technological advancement, which may help us to solve some environmental problems. But at the same time, I think these are not the solutions, because we know things are not improved a lot of environmental conditions in these countries. So what are the other things we have to think about? I think it may think about the kind of political or societal institutions we have. Maybe they are not fit for purpose. So maybe we need to reorganize our society to think about a sustainable future. I think this requires some innovation in terms of kind of system design to think about our social political system. I think I've heard also a lot of interesting voices from the global south, and then people talking about they need to get out of this, and then the status quo would not solve the problem, and then they need to reorganize their societies. Maybe there is something that learn from their culture, their knowledge. So I think this is something I would push us, especially people in the global north, to think about. And then this is why I think we need to reimagine sustainability transition. And so maybe not like through the views of developed countries or global north, and then to see what we can learn from the global south. So I will stop here. Thank you, Sophia.
Brilliant. Thank you, Yishan. Just to echo what our facilitator has put in the chat towards the audience, the participants, please feel free to post any questions in the chat box. And of course, our participants will also have the opportunity, our panelists will also have the opportunity to raise questions to each other as part of this panel discussion. Prakash, may I continue with you, please?
Hi, thank you, Sophia. Thank you, both of you, for organizing this fantastic panel. So hello, everyone. I'm Prakash Kashwan. I'm an associate professor of environmental studies at Brandeis University in Boston. And I also am one of the editors at the journal Environmental Politics. And my work focuses mainly on politics and political economy of global environmental and climate change, with a strong sort of incorporation of concerns of international development. And interestingly, increasingly, even within the global north, where some of my current work is on US, and even within the global north context, it seems that the questions of development are increasingly more relevant within the debates and discussions of sustainability transition. So that's one frame that I'm sort of increasingly, I think is becoming more and more relevant as we go along. Other parts of my sort of a thematic focus within my work is on environmental and climate justice. And I try to sort of connect this to questions of policy and political economy, rather than the sort of purely from an ethical normative perspective, which are important. But thinking about the ways in which policies structure opportunity structures for different groups, including marginalized groups, is something that I spend quite a bit of time and energy on. And analytically speaking, my work focuses on questions of power and inequality, and takes on this notion of institutional political economy. And again, thinking of institutions as those sort of structures that can be constraining sometimes, which is the popular definition of institutions, but institutions can also open up opportunities for marginalized actors to resist, to make their voices heard, and to assert their own sort of rights and agency within the political processes. So this is a slightly different kind of approach to justice as compared to some of the discussions of, say, climate coloniality, which and I'll talk about the substantive comments in the second half of the discussion. But the idea is to continue to center the ways in which sustainability transition reshapes policies, politics, and opportunity, rather than only thinking about the excluded actors and how do we include them. So that's, some of the things that we have done collaboratively. For example, the special issue on power and institutions in the world, in the journal World Development, that we developed this power matrix, which looks at both power over and power to as two sort of important components of thinking about these questions, and who are the actors whose powers get reinforced or gets diminished within the process of the institutions and policies of sustainability transition. So that's more or less the scope of my work, and I'll continue to sort of talk about some of these questions in the second part of the discussion. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Prakash. May I continue with Peter, please?
Sure. Thanks very much, Sophia, and thanks to the organisers for this opportunity. So yeah, my current work is, I'm based at Sussex University, but currently running a project on what I call supply side climate policy. So it's really looking at policies to leave fossil fuels in the ground, whether it's phase out policies or moratorias or bans on particular fossil fuels. But right through to things like fossil fuel subsidy removals, divestment, and so on, and litigation, of course, increasingly an important part of all of this. And so what we're doing with the team of researchers that I've got on board, we're tracking these supply side policies around the world, like by the type that's adopted and where they're adopted and when they're adopted and so on, to try and pick up on sort of key trends. Because for us, this is quite an important and sort of often neglected side of the study of transitions, is how do we limit production? So rather than always just trying to meet demand and add more energy sources to the mix, it's also about confronting the fact that there needs to be an accelerated decline of dependence on fossil fuels, and what does that mean in political economy and global governance terms. So we're looking at some of the so-called first movers in this space, so countries that have voluntarily left reserves of fossil fuels in the ground. So some interesting cases in Latin America where we've been doing some field work. Going to be doing some in Costa Rica, but we've already done some in Chile, Ecuador, and Colombia. In a European context, Denmark is obviously quite a leader in this space, and we've been doing some work in the UK, which is, there's sort of a lot of live debates at the moment around oil and gas licensing, but the UK has obviously been through a very unjust transition around coal, but has also adopted measures around restricting export finance for fossil fuels. So there's a range of things there, and related to that is also my involvement, of course, in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, which is more of a sort of macro global governance attempt to deal with this question of just transition. And then sort of partly related to that, at least, as an interest in the role, which picks up a little bit on what Prakash was saying. I mean, he talked about it more in terms of institutions. I guess I broaden the lens slightly to think about the role of the state in transitions. And work I'm currently doing there is trying to think about different aspects of state power. So we tend, I think, in transition to debates to think about environmental policy or energy policy or policies that directly impact on technology. So it might extend to industrial policy, but we don't say too much around the military state or the democratic state or the welfare state and many other aspects of state power and authority, which I think are also crucial to understanding the ways in which states can either enable or frustrate transition. So that's something I've been working on. And so I guess running through all of that and more activist engagements through this network, the Rapid Transition Alliance, which I helped to set up with my colleague Andrew Sims, is an interest in just transitions. And so the reimagining part of all of this, I guess, and just honing in on that just transition debate in particular, is the need, in my view, at least, to move beyond that sort of more formal Labour-centred framing of just transition. So a lot of the literature, as you all know, focused on compensating unionized coal workers in North America or the US largely. But what does it mean to think about transitions in many other contexts where they're obviously also crucial beyond coal and beyond Europe and North America or Australia to some extent? And obviously this is becoming a live issue with the ongoing rollout of just energy transition partnerships in different parts of the world, like South Africa, Indonesia, Senegal, Vietnam, etc. But ultimately, they raise issues that all countries will need to address. And I guess my concern is a little bit around coming back to comments that were made already around the problem of northern transition models, which makes certain assumptions about an effective and well-resourced state, or about organized labor, or engaged business actors, or plentiful civic space to contest transitions. And many of those assumptions don't travel well to other parts of the world. So I'm interested in that, as looking at sort of just transitions in different contexts. And in particular, perhaps picking up on things others have said already, bringing in economic justice questions there. So making it not just about questions of retraining and compensation, but also questions of trade and debt and tax. And basically thinking, and again, this brings in the development angle that Prakash and others have spoken to, about enabling poorer countries to use policy mechanisms and policies that richer countries have used to support their own industrial development in order to have a more just transition. So consciously, using subsidies or tariffs or looser forms of intellectual property protection, and not having richer countries kick away the ladder, to use that phrase, when it comes to their own transitions. And so I think that's, for me, it's more broadly that the reimagining is thinking about economic transitions more broadly, and not just ones in environmental or energy spheres. And I'll stop there for now.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Peter. Charmaine, shall we continue with you, please?
Sure. So the transition that I'm interested in investigating further would be expanding the understanding of just transition into areas where labor is invisible, unnoticed, unrecognized, especially also within the context of gender. So basically what I'm trying to reimagine for a sustainable transition is one that is mindful of pre-existing colonial relationships that are reproduced in countries where they're so-called independent and supposed to be independent and autonomous, and yet some of these transition language seem to borrow from the colonial relationships and tend to reinforce those subordinate and colonizing type of status. And so what I'm doing is basically studying policy language and identifying these traces of colonial language that denigrates the colonized subjects, and then also reinforces those types of relationships rather than empowering the colonized subjects. So in terms of projects, I have 2 projects in place. So one is preparing a manuscript that's based on my dissertation to study the language of green policies at the ILO and the nature of the responses by labor and governments by previously colonized states, more specifically India and South Africa. And then tracing the nature of that language from pre-liberation to post-liberation, and finding the vein that even though the sophisticated human rights language is used, it is still the same idea of colonization. And also understanding that not all colonized states respond the same towards green policies and just transition. One form of resistance may look different from the other, but they're still resistance. I'm also looking at the post-colonial eco-feminist response to the ILO's just transition framework, and understanding the nature of policy language in misrepresenting women and community skills in carving their own type of transition, and how the ILO's just transition may be counterproductive. And and look using post-colonial authors such as Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, Vandana Shiva, in recrafting or crafting a new type of narrative to understand just transition, perhaps trying to make it understandable from the lens of an individual in a previously colonized territory. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you so much, Sharmini. And we have Just as well to join in the conversation. Just.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Joost Vervoort. I'm an associate prof at Utrecht University at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development. And yeah, my work has transitioned from working, no pun intended, but working on more sort of policy-focused scenario work, which I've done for a very long time. I've led a large project for 10 years, first from Oxford and then from Utrecht, working with governments all across the world on scenarios around climate change and agriculture and food security development, to a sort of gradual realization, also as a result of coming into the Earth System Governance community at the time, of the politics of the future. So I was very interested in understanding better, as someone who really came from the futures field. I'm a biologist, you know, I'm coming from a very different background into this space, and just wanting to understand, how does the future operate as a site of politics, right? And how do imagined futures impact the present and actions in the present? And so part of that has been to establish a task force on anticipation and imagination, first with Aarti Gupta, and now Manjana Milkoreit is also part of that leadership, where we are exploring, and we just had a session about this morning, yeah, this question of how can we understand futures as a site of politics in the present? And this has a lot to do with, I think, the themes that other people so far have spoken about, right? It has a lot to do with who has power over what can be imagined in the present, what can be imagined in the future, which past narratives of the past matter, which narratives of the past are erased, also from a sort of colonial perspective and so on. And as time went on, I started to get more and more interested in the questions of cultural change and creative sector influence, right? The storytelling that we do as a society, because of all the work that I did in these policy spaces, while, you know, impactful in a sort of narrow way, was still always bound by these questions of, you know, capital P politics, larger ideological and questions around imaginaries and so on. So at the moment, I'm working a lot on these different creative sectors as sort of engines of imagination. I do a lot of work on this notion of imagination infrastructures, which is a term that comes from practice, that asks infrastructural questions about who gets to imagine what futures, who feels safe enough to be part of the societal efforts of imagining the future, which futures get taken seriously, and so on, and where, you know, what are the blockages and the enablers for people to be involved in those conversations in society on an everyday basis. So I do a lot of work on the games industry, which is the largest form of media out there, right? It's 6 times bigger than film. It's 6 times bigger than music. It's 3.3 billion players around the world. It's huge. And so doing a lot of work with people in the games industry around what futures are part of these mainstream games, right? I'm developing a video game myself as well with some of the best people in the industry. And working with the music sector increasingly, in general creative sectors. And sort of on this sort of these questions about cultural aspects of transition. So if I think about what I work on in terms of, and what I'm interested in terms of transitions, it is in how these how sort of action in the present and imaginations of the future interact with each other to you know, that to sort of generate and emerge that imagination, imaginaries, and sort of these ideological components of how futures impact the present. And I think a lot more can be done there to understand these cultural dimensions of societal transitions in general. So that's sort of the perspective that I hope to bring also today a little bit.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Joost. Okay, that was fascinating, not only because we have a very wide range of expertise in this virtual room, but also because you have already made, I think, some very rich contributions, or you have given us some really good starting points to start thinking about those areas of reimagining transitions. We will continue with a second round of question towards our panelists, and then we will have, of course, the opportunity for a Q&A. However, once again, if you would like to ask any questions, please feel free already to start posting those questions in the chat box. But I just want to briefly say that I'm really, really pleased with what we have achieved so far, because when we were discussing with Yishan about what it is that we want to bring with this session, it's exactly this, a form of polyphony, people coming from very different directions, working in global contexts, more local contexts, political economy, but also cultural studies, policy documents, discursive approaches. And I really enjoy this pluralism in this discussion already. Okay, so the second question to our panelists is, what do you think, according to your expertise, but also your, I would say, personal opinion as well, because I think that for some of us, there is also a personal element in this kind of research. So what do you think are the main barriers to that prevent us policymakers to reimagine the type of transition that we envision? And who do you think should take the lead in this process? So who has the power, who should have the power maybe to implement those transitions towards more sustainable futures? I will mix things a bit, if that's okay. So may I start with Prakash this time, please?
Sure, thank you. So just a small question to address. I think the question of agency, I'm glad that you brought that up. It's really, to me, that's the central question in terms of both the actual ongoing policies and political processes, in terms of who has the agency to shape those processes, but equally important, who has the agency to speak for the processes of transition. And I actually want to start with this second point, because I don't want to spend too much time, but I think it's important to highlight that because many of the sustainability transition researchers are themselves normatively devoted to the goal of sustainability as it has been defined from the mainstream, there's a fundamental tension in sometimes the researchers sort of putting their agency a bit too much into the process. And I want to sort of clarify this, because it's I think increasingly, as you pointed out, Sophia, that personal is political and sometimes the personal is important. But I wonder if there's been an overcorrection in the direction of sort of highlighting personal narratives and sort of, using those narratives to sort of make arguments about the positionality and coloniality. And in that process, we need to be asking the question about whether those narratives actually serve the goal of enlightening the discourses and debates, or sometimes the personal is taking up too much of space. And that's, to me, there's a tension between continuing to think about social and political structures as they shape agencies of marginalized groups, communities, and so forth, versus sort of highlighting sort of more abstract stories of colonialism, histories of colonialism, and their present day manifestation. Because colonialism, one of the strongest legacies of colonialism is internal inequality within the global South and within global North, and the ways in which inequalities within each of these boxes actually intertwine and interlock. So you have situations in which some of the global South elites have become the self-appointed spokesperson of poor people, and And you know, there was this really weird situation where the India's Minister of Energy and Power was advocating on behalf of African countries and sort of, you know, using African countries as a prop to sort of promote their own sort of interests and narratives within the global climate politics. And so, you know, there are these, and sometimes similarly, you know, academics can put themselves into these spaces where their own sort of advocacy seems to replace a careful, clear-headed thinking about how are the agencies of the poorest people represented in the political process. So at the intersection of personal and political, I think there's an opportunity to do more critical thinking around what purpose do some of these kinds of narratives of affect serve in this broader politics. And I really like Eustace's formulation in terms of thinking about how do different forms of politics of future get deployed in the service of the interest and ideas and perspectives of the present day actors of different types in academia, in politics, and society, and so forth. Secondly, to sort of briefly focus on the agency of the marginalized groups. And I wanted to pick up a point that Peter made very quickly about the role of the state. And it's really interesting to see how different disciplines think about some of these main actors. State has such an outsized important role, but many disciplines have a particular understanding of state as this kind of out there, monolithic, you know, sort of the political formal institution. But of course, states are also shaping the politics of transition by supporting market actors over, say, labor unions. And states, while they've been implicated in the politics of status quo, they're only the spaces where collective political arguments can be authoritatively translated into policies and institutions. And I say only in the sense that state at a theoretical level is the collective representation of different societal interests. And so in that sense, you know, for people in disciplines beyond political science or policy or political economy, I think it's important to recognize that state is this representation of societal tensions and contestations around these issues, and should be thought of as a terrain on which this politics gets played out. And the moment we take the state out of equation of our thinking, our writing, then of course, by default, there's a prioritization of the dominant actors who take up you know, much of the space in, say, global climate politics and in sustainability transition politics and so forth. So with that, I do want to sort of make a little bit of a plug for a new book, co-authored book that I have forthcoming in December. It's called Decolonizing Environmentalism and being published by Bloomsbury. And what we have done there is to sort of connect some of these debates on colonialism and coloniality to the debates on institutions, policies, and politics. Because again, because of the certain disciplinary orientation, the discussions of decolonization have yet to connect fully with debates and discussions of political economy and politics of the present day. And so we have tried to do that. And we also made it very, very accessible so that, you know, college students can actually read it without, you know, having to wade through the jargon of some of the decolonizing literature and so forth. So I'll stop there for now, and then, you know, we'll continue some of these discussions in the second half.
Thank you so much, Prakash. That was so interesting, and so many things there to unpack later in the discussion, I think. Just, can I come back to you, please, for this question, just to mix a little bit the you know, the viewpoints from which we jump into this discussion.
For sure, and I think the question of who has the power, I think I have maybe an answer to that that's maybe a bit complementary to how other people talk about this, which would be for me to reframe that question as to say, where is the energy for change? So one thing that I'm really interested in and working on is the notion of emotional energy. Emotional energy is a term that comes from sociology, from work on interaction rituals, that has this sort of perspective of humans as being a result of interaction rituals. We're going into rituals. Anything, this is an interaction ritual too, you know, collective get the, you know, comings together and so on, that are more or less successful at generating emotional energy for change, for institution building, and so on. And so the question of where is emotional energy and what is the role that emotional energy plays in the sort of the directions of society. And I'm very interested in this because I look at, of course, the cultural sort of space and so on. But there is emotional energy to be found in people telling you that you should dominate other people. Like the dominating of other people generates emotional energy for the person who dominates. But solidarity also generates emotional energy. So if we can be in connection with each other and in solidarity, that can generate a lot of emotional energy. Aesthetic experiences generate emotional energy. Spirituality. So this is an interesting topic to me. I'm working on a topic called infrastructures of mystery right now, which has a lot to do with this. How can we create societies, shape societies where being in touch with the depth and the mystery and you know, the miracle and the strangeness of life can be more sort of like forefronted. And when you look at these things, for instance, spirituality is a great source of political energy and emotional energy, but political capital, you could say, because all these sort of people who are going into sort of modern types of spirituality, but at the same time being influenced to, you know, believe in conspiracy theories and so on. Right, there's a lot of power there that people are looking for, that people are trying to engage with, also as a reaction to the world that we live in, that is emptier and emptier and emptier of meaning. And then they're there, and then they fall prey to or get engaged with, you know, radical, so for instance, extreme right ideas and so on. I see sources of emotional energy in the authority that people get from being culturally relevant figures, right? In music, but also, for instance, in sports. I think of the way that an influencer like Andrew Tate, you know, this sort of far right guy with all these problems, how he sort of leverages his position as a globally successful kickboxer in the past as this symbol of masculine power, right? He's like, I'm this height of sort of embodied physical masculinity, and now I'm going to tell all you young men that you should, you know, abuse and dominate women essentially as a way to get wealthy. So there's all these sort of societal wellsprings of emotional energy. I think a lot of the far right mobilizes resentment, for instance. I think progressive politics is very bad at mobilizing emotional energy. Some people are better at it than others, but there is a lack of, I think, of emotional sort of literacy, and a lack of literacy around what energizes people, what sort of builds social movements, what sort of like inspires people in progressive circles and in circles that are interested in societal change for a more sustainable future. That is really very dangerous, I think. So when you ask who has the power to change, you know, to make transitions happen, I think we really have to think about who is able to mobilize collective emotional energy towards political goals. And some people are just much better at it than others. And fascists, it's their whole game. It's to turn emotional energy into political capital, you know. So via very obviously very disingenuous ways, but you can be emotionally literate and literate in terms of this sort of collective energy in a way that does not have to be manipulative or simplistic, you know, or populist in its negative connotations. It doesn't have to be like that. You can engage with complexity while also generating lots of emotional energy and mobilizing that for change.
Joost, that was very topical, I can say, from the perspective of what is happening at the level of electoral politics, at least in Europe, in the US currently, but probably elsewhere too. So yeah, I think this is highly relevant as well, the broader political context and what mobilizes people towards more progressive political goals. Peter, can we continue with you, please, if you're ready?
Sure, thanks very much. And maybe just to sort of riff off what Juice was just saying. I mean, that's in a way when Andrew and I started the Rapid Transition Alliance, that was partly this need to, it was an attempt to try and inject some hope or positivity into a debate which was very much framed at the time around the IPCC 1.5 report and the rise of Extinction Rebellion, and a lot of catastrophism was in the air. And so our intervention was framed around what we called evidence-based hope, which was not sort of just blind faith, naive optimism, but by bringing together different organizations working around energy and mobility and housing and water and a whole different range of sectors, as well as drawing on historical experiences to link to that point about the role of the past in the present, was sort of showcasing can-do stories about the possibility of action as a way of calling out inaction. So anyway, but what I really wanted to say, I guess, continuing my thoughts on sort of just transitions, main barriers, I guess, are clearly there's incumbent power. We haven't talked that much about that this so far in the session, but really we should acknowledge that there's a lot of powerful, well-resourced, well-connected actors that benefit from doing nothing, from unsustainability in business, finance, the state, between north and south, of course. And that clearly is one of the key things. How do we undo, contest, push back, disconnect, powerful business actors from the state? This is absolutely vital. So as well as like building new narratives, showing the possibility of technological and social change, that it has to be about disrupting power on one level. And so I think sort of centering incumbency is important. But of course, that's not enough, because political economists like me and Prakash and others, we're very good at explaining why things don't change. And again, coming back to what Juice was just saying, it is also important to think about where are the cracks and the openings for moving things in a more positive direction. And from a just transition point of view, I guess one of my concerns is the sort of ongoing narrow belief in techno fixes, or what I've called elsewhere plug and play type transitions, that you can change the technology, you may even change the energy source, but nothing else really needs to change. And yet, I guess for me, a more just transition would have to contest power, redistribute power actively between states and citizens, or between capital and labor, or between north and south. And that's obviously a much bigger, more complex challenge, but I don't think we can ignore it. In many contexts, again, going back to what Prakash was saying, I think one of the key barriers is institutional fragility, or the lack of policy autonomy or developmental space that governments have to chart their own pathways. They're very much constrained in what they can do by corporate actors or donors or the international community shaping what sorts of decisions and pathways are even possible. And I think that's an important part of it. And then I think, and again, coming back to the previous intervention, there is something about cultural and value shifts, notions of responsibility or duty of care to others, but deeper values around materialism, individualism, and a notion of the good life. And I guess that again brings us back to futures. What futures are seen as plausible, attractive, achievable, by whom and how? Those sorts of deeper cultural value shifts, I think, are really, really important and often neglected. So in transition studies, those might sometimes appear as like landscape factors, but of course they're everyday things that people live by, our own moral and ethical and social codes, which I think are really important. And beneath that notion of the good life, of course, we're then into debates about the big underlying structures in society around growthism or extractivism or militarism, and that's even harder still to sort of excavate and meaningfully challenge. So for me, the sort of levels of analysis here, there's sort of more tangible near-term challenges, but then as you move out, you're into that sort of cultural social sphere, and then these deeper sort of structures that need to be addressed. So who should lead this? I guess it depends on which of those barriers you're talking about. So clearly movement organizing, contesting dominant narratives, I think is part of the story, like at least surfacing the possibility of change, because I think inertia and disillusionment with all aspects of politics, not just sustainability politics, plays very well to the interests of incumbent actors and those that are not interested in changing. So constantly, getting involved in change, showing that it's possible, I think is really important, and sort of, challenging dominant narratives. But there are more sort of short-term incremental things as well about basic governance reform, about the role of money in politics, like party donations and who gets to sit on committees and who represents who. This is the sort of classic stuff of political science, but it's really important, I think, in terms of rebalancing power and shifting things in a different direction. So yeah, I think I'll stop there and then maybe pick up some of these leads in questions if there are any.
Sure. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I think that was a very nice way of balancing between the big picture and then, the smaller things that we could be doing and they currently present to us as kind of barriers. Sharmini, shall we continue with you, please?
Sure. For me, the main overarching, I guess, barrier to specifically to my research would be making people understand that normalizing, colonizing, subordinating language is not acceptable because it's been depicted as neutral, it's been depicted as just the way we phrase things, but in actuality, this type of persistent and pervasive subordinating language is the thing that supports the patriarchy, that supports the capitalist economic system that tends to extract and exhaust our resources. You cannot continue to allow that kind of language. And so as a follow-up to that kind of pervasive language would be the lack of recognition of the capabilities of the post-colonial subject in terms of protecting their own environment and building and crafting their own types of transition, infusing of indigenous knowledge, native knowledge, as well as lived experience. So basically following up on what Peter was saying about context and power and how those powers can be muted in light of the marginalized and the excluded. Part of that lack of recognition of capabilities and skills is also the mix, as also Peter I think mentioned, was this misdiagnosis of solutions to through top-down technocratic policies that seem to be like solutions that apply across the board, that apply to each community affected by climate change, without giving them the voice to explain what it is that they're experiencing and be able to craft their own type of solutions. And there's also, again, like following up from Yishan's idea of development. And so some of these policy language show and point towards a grave misunderstanding of this notion of development and what it means and how people live. And so along the lines of, again, like Vandana Shiva, who says something like, if the problem doesn't exist, if communities can sustain themselves, then who are we to go and explain what a just transition is and that this should be the way that they transition? So the just transition packaging, especially within the notion of the ILO, doesn't really fix problems or may exacerbate situations. So who should then be the ones to drive it would be those who are directly affected, those on the ground who have those experiences to dictate their own future. So that's where I'll stop.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sharmini. And Ishan, we are closing this round with you where we started. Please go on.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I just want to say first that this is a very thought-provoking conversation. I really learned a lot. But I think just to save time, I just want to echo a few key points that other panelists mentioned, and then we can move to the Q&A. So first thing, I think I want to echo that now I think the just transition narrative or discourse, I think, is still very kind of labor focused. So I think we always think about the jobs, so where we can create jobs. But I think ultimately, as Peter said, it's also about economic transition. But I think to me, the kind of main barrier is how we are going to redistribute wealth. It's a question of redistribution of wealth. And this, I think this relates to the role of the state. Often we think about the sovereign state system, then they have the power to do that. But I think what we have seen, we have experienced it, and we are very disappointed about is like a lot of states are not kind of meet that expectation of people. So because we know that we need to redistribute the wealth, but this is not going to happen. That puts the question about who has a legitimate role to do this. I think this is a key barrier in my opinion, and I think we have to think to be kind of strategic, to think about where are the kind of policy levers. I think people talking about maybe that we have some important key actors sitting on some committees or trying to make some small changes in some policies. I think we talk about how to solve the super wicked problems like climate change, then we think about the past dependencies, how to use the easy levers to trigger long-term past dependent policies. I think that's there are some hopes that we may have, but I think this is also a very tricky question to think about. But I think this relates to this question about the wealth. I think then we have to think more deeply. I think as all panelists mentioned about the more like history, I think this is something we know already. The model that rich countries has developed and and also I think a lot of developing countries are following this development model. Doesn't work, at least I think for environmental sustainability. So I think this is something we have to be very clear about. So that means we need change. We must to make changes. I think we need to change this development model, the related or the political, social political system associated with this model. But also I think fundamentally it's about the culture and the value. So we need different types of culture and value to think about what kind of futures we want. I think there are a lot of barriers to that, I think, because different actors have vested interest, and then also I think ultimately it's a question of power and wealth. So I think what we want is a more kind of multipolar, diverse like world and also value system. So I think we need to introduce kind of different types of narratives and discourses. But I think what we are seeing, I think in many countries now is the political environment has become less and less inclusive. I think this is quite disappointing. I see there is a barrier there because I think if you don't think this model doesn't work, then people is not going to act into that direction. And then that comes to the question of the agency. So who can take the lead? Who should take the lead? I think to me, I think my normative position would be, I think people who are affected, who suffer by the status quo, I think they should take the lead. I think they have the energy and the motivation to do that. And then the problem is often they don't have power. So I think they are disempowered. So I think this relates to the question of empowerment. And then, for example, we think about our future, then I think it should be about young people, future generations. If we think about the context of what I do, where I do a lot of work on international development, there should be people who are affected in the global south by this global inequality, but often they don't have the power. So I think this is a key tension there. I think we have to work out. But I want to leave something still quite optimistic. I think you talk about this like far right movement or fascist, they are very good at generate emotion. But I think a lot of people working in our field, I think we are also good at trying to kind of bring hope to people. I think by listening to what you were saying, I think I also feel like we can have more energy. We can all work together. We need to make change. So I think I think if we work together and we have this belief that things can change, I think we can still, I think, make transition happen and then trying to move the transition into the direction that we want. So I see you want to react to that.
Yes, just a quick reaction.
Yeah, sure.
The head of our Green Left Party, Green Left Labour Party, I should say, the combined sort of leftist bloc in the Netherlands, when Wilders, the leader of the far right party, won, he was very shocked and angry, and he spoke about sort of being angry and shocked and upset for the world and so on. And the first thing the journalist asked him, this guy who has a history of being a bureaucrat and so on, he asked him, where was this version of you during the whole campaign? You're angry now, you're sad now, you're expressing emotions now and concern now. Why were you basically a technocrat during the whole campaign? And now that you've lost, suddenly you're showing powerful emotions. And I think that's, there's something there for a lot of people who are in this sort of technocratic mode of working with progressive politics, I think.
Yeah, that's excellent. Prakash, I know you want to jump in as well.
Very quickly, Ixin brought in the question of labor, and I think the traditional sort of understandings of just transition have focused far too much on organized labor, and that too organized labor within global north. But I think there's also some evidence that labor mobilization in some cases at least is going beyond the sort of traditional labor concerns of wages and so forth. And it's this, to recognize those sort of expansion of labor capabilities is important, because one way in which the corporate world or the powerful economic actors have tried to undermine the power and agency of the labor unions is to sort of label them as selfish, kind of actors who are only asking for their interest. And so we just published some research on the state of Maine, where labor unions have collaborated with environmental and climate groups to create this kind of broader umbrella coalition to promote, interest of both different kinds of social constituencies. But labor was also demanding stronger environmental protections within the policy-making process in, say, offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine. So I think those kinds of experiments also are important to sort of continue to learn from, because labor does happen to be a really important node of non-elite power in some ways. And so, yeah, I think just recognizing that would be good.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, definitely. And thank you, Yishan, for bringing all points together. That was very useful, I think, as well. Well, we have already 3 questions in the Q&A box. The first question by Julian. So I believe we can all see it, the question. So it's around this idea that transitions is basically the equivalent of a trade-off. So I'm just wondering if any of the panelists would like to get us started. Since we have 3 questions, I will try to keep under 10 minutes for each question, if possible, please, in case we have anything else as well coming up. So if anyone would have any comments, I'm giving you also some time to read it again.
Sophia, I think Blake can also help if our participant want to ask questions by themselves.
That's great. Yes, absolutely.
So I can actually take up that question of transition. Part of this is, of course, the great thing about interdisciplinary kind of conversations are that they bring in many different kinds of questions from different vantage points. But at times we also talk past one another from different disciplines. And so sustainability transition has been presented as a sort of trade-off kind of discussion in some quarters. But I think all of us have been arguing that, bringing together personal and political, the environmental and economic, and, thinking about the ways in which institutions become an empowering tool, and policies similarly can become spaces where you bring concerns of ecological protections with social protections, and with the ongoing attempt to sort of, move on the energy transition. So there are, I think there are a variety of different ways in which just transition is not necessarily always thought of as a trade-off, though that may be one dominant sort of, way of thinking about just transition. So that's how I think about it. And I think there's a great deal of scope to continue to learn across disciplines and across different kinds of epistemic frames that we use in different disciplines.
Thank you, Prakash. Anyone else would like to respond to this question? Which is more, I would say, comment. Yes, Charmaine, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I would like to maybe add, and excuse the noise at the back, they're having lunch at my conference. But the post-colonial ecofeminists would look at this question and look at the word trade-off, and perhaps see it as a patriarchal capitalist kind of threat that seems to suggest that you have to give up something in order to live a good life, when rather your economies can sustain you So I agree kind of in with the question where it does call for strong sustainability. It does call the post-colonial ecofeminists will say we need to move past this threat that we have to give up something in order to live the good life.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And anyone else would like to maybe share any reflections, or otherwise I will just move to the second point, which is around how useful it is actually to have this binary way of thinking around global north and global south when we are talking about reimagining transitions. And in the question, the person who is raising the question, they are also asking from a specific Australian perspective, where we have the Aboriginal population, of course, taking the negative brunt of the transition to renewable energy where they live. So yeah, is this binary way of thinking helpful in your understanding of transitions? Do we need to maintain this distinction? Isham?
Yeah, I would just maybe say a few words, but I'm sure like people doing more work in this area can share more thoughts, like Peter. But I think just to me, I think, of course, I think we don't want to have this kind of binary narrative, always kind of have this dichotomy between global north versus global south. Often it's, I think when we use the term, it's an easy way, but to differentiate the countries according to their level of development. But I think ultimately, if we think about the question of transition, is a question of power, I think. So people, like groups or actors who have the power and trying to impose their model to others, and then I think you create the tensions in this case as well. I think it's about also the question of inequality across the, I mean, when we use across the globe, so between the global north and global south, or rich countries and poor countries, but also within countries, we have different groups. I think there are, yeah, there are also always people suffer from like unjust transitions in rich countries. So I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned, but also I think that things are still happening, increasing inequality in the global north. So in that sense, I think we need more kind of collaborative work and share knowledge, not only just like people doing work in developing countries, but also like I think share knowledge and research on both global north and global south, because I think ultimately it's a common challenge. I think for people who have suffered or who are still suffering from like unjust arrangement. So I'll just stop here.
Yeah, maybe I can follow up if that's okay. I mean, I think there's some ways in which a north-south distinction can still be useful when we think about, the colonial dimension, I guess, partly, but also in terms of the way in which trade rules are set and by whom and how, and and levels of indebtedness. There are certain sort of classic north-south type questions that are still really important and might still just about broadly be understood in north-south terms, but. No, I agree with others that really it's about, for me, it's around elites, often about those who have access to power and control over resources to determine transitions or to exclude others, often through violence. And that's a function of, class and race and gender. And I think those then become more meaningful ways of trying to understand who benefits and who loses from particular transitions. Because I think, as Prakash was saying earlier, you sometimes get. He was giving the example of India, and there was that study in India done by Greenpeace and Oxfam, I think, called talking about hiding behind the poor. But Indian elites were saying basically we have no responsibility to act on the issue because there are still, vast part of the population is living in poverty and doesn't have access to energy, which is clearly true. But that doesn't deny the fact there are elites that are incredibly wealthy and over consuming as well, and that's true in all parts of the world. And it comes up constantly in debates I'm involved with around a global just transition away from fossil fuels, where you'll get elites in all countries saying that there are questions of energy poverty still and lack of connection to the grid, and therefore fossil fuels are needed to meet those needs. And yet, of course, we know that there's been decades and decades of oil and gas extraction in many parts of the world that have not benefited poorer communities because they're not the intended beneficiaries. It's always about fossil fuels for industry or for elite consumption, often in urban areas, etc. So it becomes far more meaningful to break it down, the analysis, I think, in terms of elites, and then further by class, gender, and race to try and understand really how particular configurations of power either enable or frustrate more just transitions.
Brilliant. Anyone else would like to comment on this, or we can just move on to the next point, which is maybe a little bit more relevant to our political economists, those doing international political economy specifically, which is around the corporation and the role of corporations today in transitions. And there is also a sub-question there as well, whether it would be probably more beneficial to start turning those corporations into cooperatives and the value that cooperatives could potentially bring to transitions, primarily in terms of social justice and linking that to planetary boundaries. So any thoughts on that from our panelists? Prakash, would you like to get us started?
I thought the Yixian would be a good first responder to that, but I'll just start and maybe you can come in later and add things. It's, to sort of continuing to think in the frame of power and counterpowers. Corporations are a reflection of accumulated power and resources that certain actors have collected over decades and decades of unequal and unjust global political economy. And, in principle, one would argue that many large corporations should be broken up, at least into smaller corporations. And there are already ongoing discussions, for example, in the context of these online, shopping portals such as the Amazon.com and all of that. But, from a sort of positive political economy perspective, we can, whatever we think about the role of corporations, rather than thinking about what should become of the corporations, because that's in the hands of power who actually are shareholders and, capital owners and all of that. So it's probably not in the control of sustainability thinkers, but cooperatives and other kinds of collective economic organization of resources and processes can become a source of counterpower. And so again, coming back to the power matrix that I mentioned, thinking through both institutions, policies, as well as these kinds of organizations and corporations as sources of power is one way in which we can sort of imagine reorganizing the economy around cooperatives, around networks of different economic groups. So there's, self-help, self-employed women's groups in India who have, shown models, alternative models of insuring and risk pooling and resource pooling. So I would think along those lines to sort of think about what alternative future economic organizing might be helpful, both for sustainability transition and for promoting questions of social equity and social justice.
Ishan, would you still like to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think thanks, Prakash, and also for naming me. But I think I completely agree with you. And so I think you mentioned about this question of power and then alternative business models. So I think I see this question, or I would like to break it into two parts. So one is about this kind of super powerful businesses and then how we can transform them, because I think it's very, we need to be realistic. We of course, I think we are trying to think about how to change the power system, but I think it's impossible to destroy these super powerful businesses overnight. So the question is about how we can transform them. And at the same time, I think we think about alternative business model, how to encourage alternative models, and then I think get a new wave of movement and to move our system, I think, to a new system. And then I think for the first part, I think it's important to work and engage with these businesses, and then to help them start the transition. I think, for example, we think about the existing economic system. I think they have this businesses, they have already accumulated a lot of capital, and then if they can reallocate the capital to the right direction, I think that can accelerate the transition. So I think we've seen in the past, for example, in the over the last few years, I think in the net zero movement, I think a lot of companies start to make pledges and develop the very clear and detailed transition plan to net zero. Of course, I think we need to push them more, but I think this is already like they are already acting into a good direction. I think this is already a good, I think, signal, and also that's give a strong signal to the market. And then I think all suddenly, I think people talking about how to align with net zero in their businesses, and for larger but also small businesses. So I think we have to recognize that kind of movement and then continue to encourage them. But at the same time, if we think about the future of our economic system, I think then we have to think about alternative model, how to reorganize our supply chains or value chains, and then also give those who have been marginalized or disempowered, I think, more recognition, but also I think give them a more economic power in the system. So I think Prakash gave already some examples. I think we have seen also this kind of alternative models in a lot of countries. I think it's really kind of trying to reshape the power or dynamics in global value chains. I hope that we will see this more and more, and some like emerging alternative model can really work and then give people hope that this is the direction we can move. But I can see, Peter, you also want to jump in, so please go ahead.
Is there time to just say something quickly on this?
Of course,
Sophia,
yes,
is that okay?
please.
So yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that, and I think we need to sort of, the first question is like, which businesses are we talking about? Because there are obviously big differences in terms of small and medium-sized enterprises and multinationals, and whether they're state-owned enterprises or private, you know, all of those sorts of things make a big difference about like where they're at in terms of sustainability. But I agree that more broadly, it's around, can you envisage different rules of the game? Because most businesses you talk to will always say that, you know, they operate within parameters set by society. Now that's not always true, and of course they're always actively shaping those rules and lobbying around them. But to the extent that it is true, then you know, there are requirements around liability, around disclosure, about reporting, which we can use. There are various tools and policy mechanisms to try and steer corporates in a different direction. But beyond that, as well as that sort of narrow regulatory approach, of course, there are different types of businesses, social enterprises, solidarity economies, things that people have mentioned already. But then that broader social license to operate. And I guess that's where, you know, some businesses are sort of struggling at the moment. And there's, you know, obviously a lot of conflict and resistance to investments in many parts of the world, precisely because people feel that those companies have lost that social license to operate. And that's an important part of the story as well. And then, of course, we haven't really talked about the demand and the role of consumers in all of this, but corporations in many ways are only profitable and successful to the extent that we keep buying their stuff. So there is an element around consumers and behaviors in richer parts of the world, at least, to have that power to sort of shape corporate strategies. That's an important part of the equation as well, I think.
Certainly. Okay, thank you all. We have a question from Rahel, which is on something that I think you all touched upon at some point during this discussion, and which has to do with whether the transition is something that can take place on the global level, or whether it's a little bit more useful to talk about it on the local level, so more particular contexts. And I'm very mindful of time here, so if anyone would like to quickly share a few thoughts about this distinction between the global versus the local in the context of transitions, that would be great. I think you all mentioned at some point. Yeah, Just, please.
Yeah, just quickly, I think that there's something about doing things at the local level where things are embodied and much more sort of, you know, talking about the sort of energy thing, energetically powerful and present, that can have effects at the global level, right? So if people at the local level understand how their practices and the work that they're doing is a unique source of energy and sort of mobilization that can work wonderfully at the global level, I think.
Very quickly to add to
Yes.
that, the
Of course.
globe, so we have seen in the context of global climate negotiations, they've always been undermined by powerful domestic actors who do not want international agreements to become a constraints on, capital accumulation and so forth. So that, to me, I think if we think about this in the context of the legal and policy frameworks, national and the subnational regional level is really, really very important. And again, if some of the federal polities, such as the US, where the states have very strong spaces, state level dynamics can become really important. But on the other hand, in many of the global South context where states don't have strong powers, there, we need to think more in the context of sort of national level transformative changes.
Brilliant. And very, very quickly to the last question, which is around what would be a viable way for the disempowered to fight for change to benefit them, given the role of the past here, right? Things we have touched upon during this panel discussion around colonialism and how people have historically been exposed systematically to exploitation. So how can these people, which I think some of you talked about them as those who have to be the driving forces behind sustainability transition, so what would empower these people? Any ideas or contributions on that?
Oh, this is a very difficult question.
It is.
I don't think I have perfect answer, but I think we can think about, like, just put in a very simplistic way, like different routes. So one is about like looking at the opportunities in the existing system. I think, as I mentioned, like sometimes we try to like find an easy entry point, and then, for example, important people that can that can make key decisions, and then this decision can last for a very long time, and then important decision to trigger longer processes. And then I think sometimes you just need someone who wants to make change, then who can lead the process. But then I think at the same time, the other thing is about, if we want to change the system, I think we need also a different types of system. Then we need also maybe a social movement for that. I think we've seen, for example, Extinction Rebellion trying to do that. I think, of course, I think there are some lessons to be learned, but I think there are some examples that we have seen, and then people can really join that movement and then create some momentum. Of course, how we can continue that and then to support this momentum or make them last for long, that's quite challenging. But I think these are some just brief thoughts on that, on this question. I'm sure our other panelists have also something to share.
I'm sure everyone has their own views. I know we're running out of time. Anyone for any final points around it, maybe?
So on the question of colonialism, I've been really, really inspired by a paper that Peter and Gurminder Bamra wrote on climate colonialism, which the title is More Than a Metaphor. And I suggest everyone to sort of really check out that paper to sort of think about how to think deeply about questions of colonialism, in a way that is also productive to empower the colonized post-colonial situations and so forth. So I won't go into the details, and maybe Sharmini should add some more to this, but I really love that paper and I'd like to make a plug for that.
I second that. Thank you, Prakash. Yes, I also enjoyed that paper a lot. Okay, thank you all for these so thoughtful and thought-provoking contributions today. Thank you also to our participants for their thought-provoking questions. Prakash, congratulations on your new book. We are looking forward to reading it.
Thank you.
Yes.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And thank you all again for agreeing to be part of this. I hope you enjoyed it. I definitely have enjoyed it. And hopefully we can host you physically in Bath soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thank you.
Ishan.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much.
Thanks for organizing.
Stay in touch.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for a wonderful conversation.